Let the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. A few weeks ago when I preached, I told you that during the summer months, I like to use the first lesson, the Old Testament lesson, as the basis for my sermon, and obviously we know that it's summer. Usually the message that the pastors talk about on Tuesdays at our text study is usually the gospel, and I will tie that in today, even though I'm using the Old Testament lesson, the prophet Ezekiel. I'm sure Ezekiel is one of your favorite books. How many of you use that for your daily devotions? How many of you know where even it is in the Bible? Some of you do. Some of you do. I'll tell you. Ezekiel comes right after the book called Leviticus. How many of you use Leviticus regularly? It's another favorite book. I got my schedules confused as far as when I was preaching. I thought I was preaching last Sunday, but Richard Anderson was stuck in there in between, and so I'm on this Sunday. But last Sunday, the Old Testament lesson was from the book of Leviticus, and I had already started thinking about that. And I already had done some stuff as far as what I might preach about. And being Leviticus is so close to Ezekiel, I want to mention it today. Leviticus between the prophet Isaiah, the prophet Jeremiah, and the prophet Ezekiel. And when I preach, I like to tie in the theme for kind of what the world is going through, what we're going through right now. We have been, and we are in, a period when there are great lamentations. Lamentations comes from the word lament. And lament means to be in grief, to be in sorrow, to be angry, to be in stress or anguish. We are going through a period when there are so many children lamenting because they're separated from their parents who have crossed the border. Parents lamenting, not having any idea of where their children are, or when they find out that they're miles and miles away. Spread out all over this country. If you watch TV, you didn't see a video of much of it, but you heard the sounds. You heard the cries and lamenting of separated children. And you heard it called fake news. Don't believe it. There were and are real lamentations taking place. It's happened for several thousand children and parents. So much of our news is about separation. Even this morning, in the Arizona Republic, the front page, the story of a woman who came across the border to seek asylum with a 6-year-old boy. She was sent back by herself to Guatemala, and her 6-year-old son is still here lamenting not being with his mother. The people in this country have been lamenting about the decisions that have been made about this that is going on, about the inhumane immigration situations in our country. We need immigration laws. We do not advocate strictly open borders, but we need immigration laws that are just and moral. There have been court orders about the needs about doing something about that. And we find out that even the government doesn't even know where all the parents and children are, even having to use DNA to try to figure out some of that stuff. It's slow. Lamentations continue. What can be done? I don't have the answer. But we're waiting for something to be done. But there are some good news stories that go on. People that are doing something. people who are showing kindness and love. A group right here in Arizona decided to raise money, to raise bail for some of those who are incarcerated. This group now down near Eloy raised more than they had anticipated. And they bailed out a woman from the Eloy place where they're detained. And they decided to send her back to her daughter who was in New York City. Can you imagine that? Eloy to New York City, that far away. The group decided to send this mother to New York. And they decided that they were going to do it, but they were not going to do it through public transportation because they didn't trust the authorities that she could actually get back to be with her daughter. So they decided to drive her back by car. Not one person taking her all the way. They organized a relay team from Eloy to New York City where somebody would take her part way and then they would turn her over to somebody else, and they would do that over and over again until she got back to be reunited with her daughter. Another place that was raising money because of love raised over millions of dollars because of that. And I want to let you know that there are non-government organizations, some who have been recognized for what they're doing, who are showing compassion and love. Many of you are probably not aware of an organization, and this has been mentioned in the news because of what they've been doing. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, LIRS. It's not a new organization that's just come up. It has been in existence for over 80 years. It started during World War II. My wife and I have contributed readily, regularly to LIRS. In the next month's newsletter, the outreach, I already have an article that talks about Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. I list the website so you can go onto that and find out exactly what this group is all about. And also the address if you too want to contribute to this cause. And so we look at Ezekiel, the first lesson. It comes right after Lamentation. As I said, Lamentations comes right between Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And the people are lamenting the fall of Judah and Jerusalem, lamenting the fact that the Babylonians have come in and conquered them and have taken off the leading people in Judah and carried them off to Babylon. Jeremiah was the prophet in Judah and Jerusalem before that fall. And Jeremiah was always in trouble because he was talking out against what the leaders were doing in Judah and Jerusalem. And so the residents, or some of the residents in Jerusalem, the leading ones, were carried off into exile into Babylon, deported. Babylon today is what is Baghdad in Iraq. There were two deportations. Ezekiel was in the first one, and he was living in exile. The second was in 587, when all but the lowest of the people of Judah were taken away into exile. And at that time, the walls of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem were destroyed. And the people of Judah and Jerusalem were there for 50 years before they came back during the time of the minor prophets. Ezekiel was not a prophet when he was deported, when he was put into exile. He was a priest. He was a priest. And that's why he was one of the first to go. In Babylon, the priests had no real position because there was no temple in Babylon. And he was used to the temple rituals as a priest, and that's what he did. So the Old Testament lesson that was read today by Betty is about the call for Ezekiel to be something other than a priest. Call. I think you know that word, don't you? The American Lutheran Church, we're very much concerned about call. We have a call committee. We're looking for a new senior pastor so we can request that he or she will come here. And a call means a request for somebody to do something. You got reports, and you know that in just under a month, the candidate that they've call committee has chosen will be here. He's not preaching that weekend, but he and his wife will be here. And I hope that whoever comes will not just be a pastor, but will dare to be a prophet as well. The call for Ezekiel. Called to be a prophet. The first chapter of Ezekiel begins with these words. I was among the exiles by the river Chebar, and the heavens were opened, and I saw a vision of God. On the 5th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, and the hand of the Lord was on him. And then Ezekiel goes on in chapter 1 to describe that vision. And the first verse, or the last verse in chapter 1, the verse just before the lesson that Betty read today, reads like this. When I saw it, the vision, when I saw it, I fell on my face. And then the first reading begins with Ezekiel lying on his face. And the words, O mortal, stand on your feet, and I will speak to you. And when he spoke to me, the Spirit entered into me and set me on my feet. Those are the words that originally prompted the title of my sermon today, Called to Stand. Ezekiel stood, and God spoke to him, called him to be a prophet. Like I said, remember, he was a priest in Judah. And it's quite different from being a prophet. For as a priest, all he had to do was do the rituals that took place in the temple surroundings. As a prophet, he had to speak out for God against many things. It was his job to do that. And people often didn't like to hear what he said. Prophets had a difficult time. Prophets were readily ignored. Before the exile in Judah, as I said, Jeremiah was a prophet there. He was treated terribly. He was mocked. He was put in stocks where you have your hands and your head held together. When he could still talk to the people, they dumped him in a cistern so people couldn't hear him anymore. Probably one of the dreaded things for a Jewish boy was to wonder if God would ever call him as a prophet. And he didn't want that to happen because that was no easy task. Ezekiel became a prophet. That was his second career. And he was told by God to speak up, to let people know what was right and what was wrong. And he says, speak to a rebellious people and say, thus says the Lord. He had a tough time as a prophet. It was easier when he was a priest. The Old Testament lesson, Ezekiel. And I said I'd like to tie the gospel in with the first lesson. And the gospel that Pastor Bud read is from the Gospel of Mark. And it's about Jesus. It's about Jesus going to his hometown of Nazareth and not being accepted there as a prophet. And they said, isn't this the carpenter? Note it doesn't say the carpenter's son. He said, isn't this the carpenter? And they took offense at him. They wouldn't listen to him or accept him for who he was. Even his own family would not accept him for what he was and what he said. So Jesus moved out of Nazareth. He moved to Capernaum. He had come back to them as a prophet. not a carpenter. And he, like Ezekiel, was a prophet as a second career as far as his life was concerned. He, like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others, were not always accepted by the leaders. Jesus was not accepted by the leaders of the Jews. We can name some instances why he wasn't. Times he said, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you," like when he said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. No, you got to love. You got to do things differently than that. He told them a new way, a way of loving. Jesus associated with Samaritans, Gentiles, and to the leaders of the Jews, that was a no-no. He chased the money changers out of the temple, shooed off the animals that they were selling at exorbitant prices. He busted up their operation that was milking the people. And he healed on the Sabbath, and on and on. So the leaders wanted Jesus gone. And they succeeded in that. They asked for his death, and they got it. They didn't get rid of him because he was Jesus the Christ. They didn't get rid of him because he was Jesus the Christ. They got rid of him because he was Jesus the prophet. They didn't see him as the Christ as we do. And perhaps we see him too much as the Christ and not enough as the prophet. Even the Jews and Islam see Jesus as a prophet. And Jesus is mentioned more in the Quran than Muhammad is, as far as Islam is concerned. Muslims see him as such. For God is the God of the Muslims as well as the Christians. God is a God of all people of creation. God doesn't base his love on us on our right beliefs, but on his love. Jesus grew up and became a prophet at age 30. We celebrate his birth in December. And we celebrate his birth so much we even have Christmas in July at American Lutheran Church in a couple of weeks. Jesus almost didn't get a chance to grow up. Did you know that? He almost didn't get a chance to grow up. And Joseph and Mary were smart enough to make sure that his death didn't happen as an infant in Judah. Pastor Bud reminded us at our text study when we talked something about Leviticus. And the situation, how when Jesus was born, and Herod, the king, had his nose bent out of shape, and he was worried that there was going to be a new king, and he ordered that all infant boys 2 years and under should be put to death. And how Joseph and Mary did not hang around, but they fled. They fled to another country. They fled to Egypt, and they went into Egypt. They crossed the border for asylum. Jesus, as an infant, was a refugee. They said, and Bud said, it's a good thing that Egypt didn't have the same policy for refugees fleeing from threats of death as we do right now in the U.S. Egypt didn't separate Jesus from Mary and Joseph. They didn't send them back to Judah and Herod, but he was safe there in Egypt. And if Jesus was here today, he'd have a lot to say about what has gone on. Unfortunately, there would be a deaf ear to much of what he would say even today. People need to stand up for what is moral, what is humanitarian and just. On TV recently, someone made a statement doing an interview. The statement was, why don't more ministers stand up and speak out? Good question. Probably because ministers don't want to be political, and that's good. And we shouldn't be partisan political, but willing to stand up for what is moral and what is just. Not just to do what is Christian, but to do what is godly. Marches a week ago yesterday, all across the country, about people who stood up for what was going on. The picture in the front page of your bulletin today is a picture that was on the front page of the Arizona Republic last Sunday, just last Sunday. The picture of 4 clergy standing, holding that banner that says, "Standing on the side of love." They were called to stand, and if I would have been there, I would have stood with them at that particular time. If we believe that God is love, then we had better be there too. Stand up to be prophets. And if there are those of you today who think I have said too much about the injustices in this country, if that's what you think, that affirms that maybe I too can be a prophet. And as the end of our reading today says, they will know that there's been a prophet among us.